So good morning, everyone. My name is Darryl Peak. I'll be your moderator today. I'm looking forward to the discussion where we talk about artificial intelligence, where we talk about big data analytics, and also breaking through the hype. There's a lot of discussion around it. They say one of the things is what'll make you laugh will make you cry. And data is one of those things because there is a certain aspect of convenience which was brought up in one of the initial discussions around data. I believe, am I on? Hello, can you hear me? Okay. But at the same time, our adversaries are using data as well to understand us, to understand our activities, and also to understand our vulnerabilities. So what I have is a great panel here today, and we're just kind of awkwardly constructed. So some of you may speak toward the back of our heads, or we may be speaking not in your direction, but we want to make sure that you all feel engaged throughout this discussion, and we will make sure that we answer all questions as we get them. One of the things, we don't have a lot of time. We only have 30 minutes, so we want to keep the questions kind of short and direct. However, we have some experts on our panel who will be able to give you some great perspective. And with that being said, before I get into questions, I'll have each one introduce themselves. Take about a minute or so. Mike?
So Mike Lipinski, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Security Strategist for Securonix. We are a behavioral analytics company. I've spent 30 years in IT, 20 of that in information security and risk, so I come at it from both perspectives, the enabling side of IT and the securing side of the business.
John McClurg, did 10 years in academia, a decade with the FBI as they were standing up their cyber capabilities, and now nearly 20 years in the private sector as the CISO of Lucent, Bell Labs, Honeywell, most recently with Michael Dell. Actually, it's been a year now that I jumped to Cylance as the vice president of that new emerging AI machine learning company.
Hi everyone, I'm Robert Lord, co-founder and CEO of Protenus. We use artificial intelligence to detect and prevent data breaches specifically in healthcare. I came to the field kind of in a circuitous manner. I actually started my career as a quant in finance, building machine learning and artificial intelligence models to trade securities, but had a crisis of faith, went into healthcare, and then in healthcare saw that there was this pretty terrifying problem with how we're securing our health data, and ended up dropping out of med school with another med student to start my company, and that's been going strong for many years now. So weird route to cyber, but that was mine. And those of you behind me lucked out. You don't have to look at my face most of the time, so that's good.
Which your mother loves.
She's the only one. Yeah, and not all the time.
And I'm Darryl Peak from DHS. I'm the Director of Operations for the Office of the Chief Technology Officer and the CIO. Previously with the National Protection and Programs Directorate, Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. So as far as this discussion, it was on the premise of one of the papers on the ICIT website, Dragnet Surveillance Nation, How Data Brokers Sold Out America, which talks about how our data is being collected, used, and sold in order for profit, but also when it's put in the wrong hands, it's sold for cents on the dollar in regards to its use in the adversary's hands. So with that being said, we're going to have two discussions. One talking about artificial intelligence and big data analytics and what these companies are doing in response to that, but also some of the misconceptions associated to what big data analytics means, what artificial intelligence means, and our signature-based approach is going to become irrelevant in the next couple of years. So with that being said, I wanted to get everyone's perspective on what is artificial intelligence and why should everyone in this room care about it? Right?
So I think I'll start with just the definition. I hear a lot of this, especially in my field, artificial intelligence, machine learning. There seems to be sometimes they're used synonymously. They're really not the same, but in a half an hour, we're really not going to have this debate. So let's just throw out and encompass them all in an analytics discussion, whether it's AI or machine learning. But the benefit of the technology is to really help us do a lot of the things that we're doing manually today. You know, we have data available to us. When you go back and read about whatever your favorite breach has been over the last 3 years, the one thing you'll notice is that we've had data to go back in forensically and determine the who, what, when, how, and why things have happened. And so what we need to do better is use that data proactively. And we're failing there today because we're using our human resources, which we're already short of, to do a lot of that manual work, to try and correlate data, to try and build relationships, to try and do a lot of that, those things that we want a piece of technology to do. So AI and machine learning, to be able to bring all of that together, to be able to build those relationships, build behavioral profiles and find unknown unknowns or determine things that are happening that are weird within your environment. That's really the power of that technology, to enable your people now to have much more rich information so that they can find those unknown types of threats.
And given the pace at which the adversary is now morphing, again, another punctuation of the fact that we just can't rely on the humans that are inserted into the process, particularly when it comes to the testing we're going to demand before we introduce, let's say, a new DAT file into production, given what could potentially go wrong. That's the cadence and speed of that process, that historic process, is just failing us miserably given the pace and speed and the resilience and the agility of the adversaries to morph and tweak each new attack. And so that's why we have to care, and that's why we need to move this direction, because the adversaries have moved on. And we either do it, we keep pace with them, or we pay the consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and really, it's hard to improve upon the answers before me, but one of the key things also that's worth separating out, as we've talked about, machine learning and artificial intelligence is indeed very difficult to separate out. But another term that gets bandied about a lot is big data as well, and it makes sense to separate that out, really. I think of big data as simply the problem that arises when the size of your data becomes a part of the problem in the same way your analytics were a problem before, right? So you actually need to start engineering creative solutions to deal with that scope of data.
You know, as a warrior in the trenches, I heard about AI and machine learning as a practitioner, a battle. I don't care. I didn't care whether I could distinguish or tell you the distinction between it. What I did is I grabbed the solution that claimed to have certain powers, whether it was machine learning based or AI. Didn't matter in the end, because what I did is I tested it, and then I judged it on its result, and I could care less whether I could ultimately distinguish whether it's machine learning or AI. All I want to see is the results in the product.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most advanced systems in the world that call themselves AI or machine learning or big data systems still have many components that are remarkably simplistic within them, combined with more appropriately complex components. And it's really the symphony that comes together with all these pieces of the analytical orchestra that make a really great system.
So one of the things I wanted to add on, and this is just moderator's privilege, as far as the algorithms that you use and the importance of these algorithms, could you talk a little bit about the algorithms that help inform artificial intelligence and what it means?
Well, the algorithm is important, but I think even more important is ultimately just the huge quantities of data that you ultimately feed it, because you get garbage in, garbage out, right? And so that's why, you know, just taking years to amass billions of files and using that, and to constantly feed her. She's hungry. I use she. She's hungry. She's eating even while I'm sleeping, and the more data we feed that in, it becomes critical, so that it feeds into that algorithm. I mean, the first time, the algorithm is important, but I remember the first time I tested my first instance of AI or machine learning. The math model we actually used was 6 months old. You know, and it would still beat the signature-based approaches, you know, given that even that age difference. So I don't want to undervalue the importance of that algorithm.
Yes, sir. Anything you want to add?
I think I'll just pile onto that. It's important, and I'm not even going to go into a lot of the underlying math, because that's not my background. I have to meet with our data scientists every quarter because I'm supposed to stay in the forefront of our technology. They blow my mind. It's like, oh, I have a couple glasses of wine and try and forget about it. But I think it's a combination of not just the math and the underlying technology, the algorithms, but also the big data piece. So whether you like the term big data or not, it is a problem, because if you're going to leverage the strength of AI, machine learning, you need to consume more data than we typically consume today as information security professionals or risk professionals. I want to bring a lot of that unstructured data in. So it's going to become a big data issue. You've got to have a way to house that. You've got to have a way to consume that in real time. You've got to have a way to correlate that. And then you can leverage the power of the technology, the machine learning, the AI.
Right. And in entertainment, we often see examples of AI when you think Terminator, or when you think I Am Legend, you see these robots making decisions on their own. But one of the discussions that I listened to a couple of weeks ago was John Edwards, who is the CIO of the CIA, and he indicated that innovation sounds cool, but we have to make sure that it's business relevant. So in regards to business relevance of AI, could you give some examples and thoughts on business relevance in a lot of environments?
In my term as a CISO, I've always, no matter what company I worked for, no matter how well they were doing, how pleased the street was with them, I was never given a blank check. you know, they always said, hey, mitigate unacceptable risk, understand what falls above and below the unacceptable and the acceptable, and then mitigate that risk at a price point that's going to still leave us competitive in the marketplace. So there's always that dimension of at what price point can you deliver that mitigation? And historically, in large part because of the anemic performance of our signature-based AV solutions, you've had to assume that you're going to build out a very elaborate, very complex defense and depth structure. So when it penetrates down the kill chain, you're somewhere along you're going to get lucky and stop that. And to be able to do that at a price point that makes your company ultimately competitive. Now that comes with a huge price tag. Those elaborate structures are huge. So where AI starts to bring in a really ROI and a strong message is if you start realizing that you can apply it up here in the kill chain so that less of that complexity and that costly structure below can be relieved, you can then liberate those resources over to some other pressing problem like insider threat that we're going to have to grapple with, liberate those resources down deep in that defense structure over to those sorts of things, and that's where you're going to bring back that value add to the company that's going to resonate from a business perspective.
Yeah, another critical thing that we see, particular somewhat to healthcare, is often the need for identifying insider threats crosses very much into the HIPAA and privacy office of what we do. And one thing that's often very critical about deploying these more advanced techniques is also being able to reverse engineer explanations to them. So you have to be able to elaborate as to why something is occurring, what are all of the components that make this more or less suspicious, and really present that in a natural language way to individuals who may not be as technically sophisticated as, for instance, your average network security analyst or all these people that you're describing as necessary for a defense in-depth strategy. And so one of the challenges, but also one of the opportunities provided by a lot of natural language processing techniques allows you to really create reports themselves and offload a huge amount of work on that front, which is normally a very, very laborious process, not just the detection, which is key, that how do you get to real validated threats instead of a lot of false positives and just kind of signature-based junk, but also all the way down that chain to really adding value at the final report and description level as well.
So I think it goes back to a comment I made earlier. You heard a lot of comments this morning about it's not the if, it's when. You may already be breached. So you have to work with the assumption that the breach is inevitable. So you're constantly in detect and respond mode. And so to do that, I really need the business value is really in eliminating a lot of that noise within my environment and making my people far more efficient by giving them more rich and more accurate information so that they can be more accurate hunters. My insider threat program can be more resilient. My fraud program can be more resilient. So that's really the business value to the organization.
Because I've been in the business so long, I have to take somewhat responsibility for the creation of that mantra, not if but when. It seemed a tactical move on my part, because if indeed, as I came out of government into the private sector, I knew we were going to get compromised. If I had already massaged or messaged that not if but when the attack did occur, rather than being summarily fired, we could turn our discussion to something more productive, like how quickly did we detect, how efficiently did we expel. But I think I'm reaching a point now where I feel we may be able to finally, as a profession, back away from the adherence and the dedication we give to that mantra, not if but when, and instead of putting an exclamation mark, start putting a question mark at the end as something we may actually be able to forestall for a far greater period of time than we've ever been able to do to date, especially as we divert these other resources.
Yeah, and I've seen AI capability, some of your products actually. I thought it was very interesting to see, but one of the things that comes to mind is that we are in a period of modernization. So a lot of the discussion is around signature-based approaches, which you mentioned earlier, Robert. So what are your thoughts as far as the modernization approach? Because a lot of the implementations are very small implementations and not giving us full coverage. So how are these hybrid organizations going to soon adjust to moving from a signature-based to a more behavioral-based approach? And are there any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I think modernization or transitioning to any new technology is facilitated greatly if the disruption the transition exacts of you is minimized. And that comes down to what sort of footprint do you leave on this endpoint that's been assailed for decades. We've loaded up on the poor endpoint that we call it a boat anchor anymore. As you try to modernize and you transition, if you're liberating some of that weight that we've poured onto the endpoint so that it's freed up, consume very little CPU, then that modernization or that move is going to be a lot less painful and more easily and quickly embraced.
The question around value, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but it's also a discussion around convenience. Because as we put load on infrastructure, that kind of impacts their ability to have productivity in our environments. So could you talk about how your products interact within these networks and the value that you're bringing, but also the load that you aren't adding to the productivity?
I can speak to ours, though we have a somewhat more specific application than, say, a Cylance or a Securonix in many ways. But we're actually a pretty lightweight cloud product that sits on top and really ingests data from across these systems in a manner that allows us to build that constant intelligence around these threats and understand in great detail what basically for every single user, for every single individual has access to any type of information within a hospital or health system or other type of health data containing organization's network, what is appropriate versus inappropriate activity from a clinical or administrative perspective. And so in a lot of ways, we don't have some of the same challenges that come from endpoint agent deployment and things like that. But we kind of say, well, the kind of 95% of this problem is actually, for healthcare at least, is contained in a very different space, and so we leverage to solve that issue.
And I kind of touched on that already.
Right.
If the solution you're introducing is going to liberate or allow them to jettison, let's say, what's taken 8 different solutions on that poor endpoint, and you can do it now with one, it's going to speak for itself.
I like that point, John. Endpoint liberation.
Yeah.
That's a good one. From our standpoint, it's a little different. A year ago, we were sitting in what they called the UEBA space, the behavior analytics space, and you were duplicating a lot of data because you were sitting on top of SIM, you were bringing a lot of stuff in, performing analytics, maybe sending data back to SIM. As this market evolves now, you're in the term security analytics platform, and whether SIMs evolve, whether the UEBA companies come up, you're going to see this work itself out over time. But you're looking at these next gen platforms that are combinations of big data loggers, SIM, behavior analytics, and bringing all of that together. So yes, there is additional overhead. It's more efficient than the way we've done it in the past. It's more efficient than the way we've done it in SIM, both economically and performance-wise, but you're also tapping into data that you've never tapped into before, so that's additional load. I want to defend data where it resides. I need data at my applications. That's stuff that's not typically sucked into SIM today. That's load on the network. That's load on the servers. I want to defend the whole IoT, the Internet of Everything and anywhere, right? So how do I do that? The best way to do that is network data in most cases, since they're dumb devices a lot of times on the end. That's a big burden on moving that data across the network. So yeah, there's overhead associated with it. There's planning that has to be involved, and so it is something to consider. That's why it becomes a big data nightmare.
Right. Now, are there any questions? We're about to move to another topic string, but yes, Mike.
So quick question is, obviously when we move into the cloud, unlike our infrastructures that we have now where we basically can see all elements of the stack and all of the log traces from every layer of abstraction, we're going to have invisibility for a lot of this. For example, Salesforce.com is the SaaS. You're not going to get the lower things on the stack. So I'm just curious, how do we do behavior analytics, and how do we get that type of information in those cloud architectures?
But we elude that conundrum by not being dependent on behavioral analytics and not depending on the cloud in any way, because you don't have to go to the cloud for those updates because it sits on each of the endpoints and is free and independent, again, liberated from that need to reach out to the cloud for that most recent DAT file update, and can still churn out, like I said, at 6 months old, the kind of efficacies that we absolutely have to have, given the way that the adversaries are morphing.
I think it's probably a combination of a couple of things. I had a really good panel discussion actually yesterday on that exact topic. And it's two things. It's a combination of your vendor risk management approach and what you're expecting cloud providers to do. You can demand certain things, and some of them will and some of them won't comply. And when they don't comply, you'll have a choice to make. But most of them, or a lot of them today, are allowing you to consume a lot of that data. I think we have 16 to 18 different connectors to different cloud providers already where we can consume all of that data, and that can be correlated with your on-premise data, so you can bring all that together. If you're working with somebody that's not going to give you that ability, then you'll have that choice to make. If you've assessed them and you're willing to accept that risk, then you can move forward with them. If they're not going to play, not going to give you access to your logs, to your data, then that's a choice you're going to have to make.
Yeah, really just augmenting Michael's point. In healthcare in particular, a lot of the agreements for data usage are governed by business associate agreements, which are your kind of data use agreements and vendor risk management types of agreements. And so it really goes down to what's your strategy for understanding, mapping out your data, and then managing all of those individuals that may be connecting to or feeding your information. And then critically prioritizing what types of systems and data that you want to analyze for the purpose of this type of analytic process.
So one of the things that is taking place, because we already talked about the importance or the challenge in regards to human and manual interaction for cybersecurity, but also do you feel that more of the recent legislation has aided in some of that discussion and moving the pendulum forward and utilizing more behavioral or automated techniques towards managing our cybersecurity practices?
I am no expert, but I think we have a long way to go
Okay.
with regard to that. I think that a lot of times there is a good amount of lip service paid without a lot of real, sometimes they'll present a stick, but not a lot of carrots. In our industry in particular, and in all industries, you've got pretty tight margins and not necessarily a great understanding or great budget allocated to cybersecurity, right? It's a cost center in many cases, though some industries are switching to understand it as a more strategic priority, which is a good change. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity in the federal government, state governments, and other organizing bodies to say, how are we really going to incentivize organizations to transform their cybersecurity infrastructure, realizing that as a nation, we're only as strong as our weakest points with regard to data and information systems. And to me, it seems like a significant national priority to make sure that that cash goes to where it's really needed, and that's the front lines.
Right. And John, as a former Fed, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, I think the federal is pretty good at leveraging, painful lessons learned. It quite often, unfortunately, requires that. And OPM, for all its glory and the pain it caused me personally, stands out there as this sort of clarion call to learn from that and to leverage the message it tells us in terms of AI, machine learning, the extent to which you need to extract the human. Try not to, and as intriguing and as hard to develop as behavioral practices have been, to the extent that they're still very much inclining us in the reactive world, we need to take note and actually leverage AI and machine learning to catapult us, what I've been waiting for since the time I was a Fed, being to move out of the stymied world of the reactive into the proactive prevention that this now affords us. And I see indications. So look, you can't have a paradigm that's been dominant and in place that long and not still see vestiges of it emerging in the language and the orientation of even, commendable new legislation. You can say, but they're still seeing the vestiges of this old paradigm there. And yet you see even in the NIST, the rewrites of NIST and things, you see some opening up there to allow for AI and some automated responses that are going to liberate and not be so dependent on these humans that we have been.
So I paraphrase the "I'm hopeful" comment. We're hearing a lot, and with the whole modernization talk, it's now an opportunity for IT and information security to get together and work together from the start, and not build piece parts and secure it after the fact that it was already built. We have an opportunity to do it right, but there's always that cost factor. So that'll have to shake itself out, and we'll have to see where that ends up.
Right, and actually John was referring to the cybersecurity framework. It actually came out of the Executive Order 13666. So Valentine's Day on both ends was important for that piece of legislation. And also in regards to legislation, there have been over 13 pieces of legislation in regards to cybersecurity in the last 3 years. So there is definitely a lot to catch up on, but still, as mentioned, still a lot to do. So we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to give some closing thoughts, but before we get to closing thoughts, is there an additional question that anyone would like to ask? Yes, sir, Nick.
I have a question. With AI and machine learning, we're thinking about all the things that have happened in the past, but how do you think about black swan events or something that is going to be a novel approach? I'm not the expert here, the gentlemen here are, but I'm just thinking the next thing could be quite different and simpler or even more rudimentary, not necessarily fancier in terms of the attack.
I think one of the saving graces is that the bad guys have been as lazy as the good guys. And when you talk about black swan events, a truly, completely new and heretofore unseen event that started with a complete blank canvas, the genomic structure or signature of which, could not be known to our model, is theoretically a possibility. That's why we stay humble, because, but it'll have maybe that first immediate appearance, but the speed and pace at which it can then be ingested by your mind and included back into the math model is so much quicker than what we're currently grappling with that it gives one hope that, surely those are going to come. We anticipate, we're trying to think, put our evil hats on and think like the bad guys. How are they going to try and leverage AI itself and machine learning to advance their interests? And yet, can leverage these past successes in establishing a basis of hope going forward.
It's probably actually the bigger battle is when we start getting AI to AI. We're not there yet. They're not using it from a weaponized standpoint, but when you start getting that. But to your question, today you're searching for known knowns. You're writing rules. You're using signatures. You're trying to find things you know about, and that's why we fail. That's why we're not finding those new attacks. And the behavioral analytics, the AI, the machine learning technologies will allow you to build baseline profiles and find abnormal things that happen. It can be the way a device performs. It can be a communication within the environment. It can be a new file loaded on a desktop. You've got companies coming at it from multiple different ways, and it can be any change within any parameter within that environment. It can be the way a SCADA device is working today versus how it's working tomorrow. So you can even manage those critical infrastructure devices now. So that's the real benefit it's going to bring to you. So when that next unknown type of attack comes, you have a chance to catch it. I'm not saying there's no one silver bullet, there's no one box that can solve all problems, but it's going to give you that best chance of finding those unknown unknowns that we are missing today.
Yeah, I mean, to just really echo and amplify the existing points. There is this, I think, common slight misconception around AI and machine learning that it can only detect exactly what has been seen before. But really what it's doing is it's decomposing at a fundamental level all of the components that went into a malicious activity happening or a negative activity happening, whatever you want to call it. And those constituent components will show up in so many different ways and in so many different fashions that it's very rare to see something that is completely new, as you mentioned, right? You're constantly looking for these factors that look awry, for these different types of signatures and for these different approaches. And in fact, in many ways, this system is gaining a deeper understanding of how things really function and how they malfunction than any human ever really could a priori. And that's what's really exciting about it. It's not just looking at the past, it's really in many ways helping us build the future of protecting these systems.
So we have a lot of government and industry leaders in the room. So as a close, I would like for you to direct your final comments on what should they do in order to, one, understand, but some of the things that they should do in order to look at their network from a strategy or tactical perspective. So what are some closing thoughts that you have, Mike?
From my standpoint, I hear a lot that this is a sophisticated technology and I have to be at some level of maturity to really deploy it. And I guess my advice to you is that couldn't be farther from the truth. I started that way when I started, about 1.5 years ago, because I thought the same thing. But as I've worked with more and more people, you can put this into legacy or very immature environments, and it'll actually help you prioritize as you're going through your modernization effort. It'll actually help you prioritize those investments that you need by helping you identify quickly those areas where you have higher risk.
And there's so much passion out there in the environment right now. It's easy to be beguiled by someone's passion. I'm told I exude a certain amount of passion. A certain amount of it had to move me from Dell over to where I am now. And I said, but, my response to my old government peers would be, don't be beguiled by the passion. Do what OPM did. They had to test for themselves, right? They found out for themselves. And you don't have to understand what goes on in the black box. We never will probably understand what's going on in her mind as she's doing what she's doing. But you don't have to. You can test it yourself and see the fruits, on top of what the OPM already reported out, and validate that and move forward with those concrete results in hand.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And for me, my particular clarion call always relates to healthcare and critical infrastructure sectors in general. I think there's so many tremendous lessons learned from different industries that have done and approached this well. You look at finance to a certain extent. You look at and all you're going to be like, well, maybe, but there's some industries that have done a better job than others. I live every day in healthcare, which is among the most terrifyingly poorly implemented with regard to privacy and security. And so better ways to share not only the knowledge between these sectors that have done things better, as well as how we typically think of signatures and all what threat sharing means in a vernacular way, but really sharing that knowledge and that, I think more than anything, that institutional will and orientation towards thinking about privacy and security in a strategic way, in a way that is not a cost center, in a way that continuously adds value, and that is critical to the mission of the underlying business. That sharing of attitude and that sharing of perspective and policies that push forward all of that into the private sector, to me, that is what is absolutely most critical.
Fantastic. Well, the clarion call has been made. Hopefully, if you have any questions, feel free to approach any of our speakers. Thank you, gentlemen. Can you join me in thanking our speakers today?
Thank you, Darryl.